İkinci konuşmacımız Profesör Tadeusz Majda. Kendisi Varşova Üniversitesi Doğu Çalışmaları Fakültesi'nde profesör, Varşova Ulusal Müzesi Doğu Sanatı bölümünde küratör ve bir oryantalist. Türk Dili Edebiyatı ve Kültürü, özellikle de Osmanlı dönemi uzmanı ve İslam sanatı uzmanıdır. Profesör Majda, 1983'te Varşova'da 7. Uluslararası Türk Sanatı Kongresi'ni düzenlemiştir. 1979'dan beri Uluslararası Türk Sanatı Kongreleri Daimi Komitesi Genel Sekreteridir. Varşova Ulusal Müzesi'nde çok sayıda sergi düzenlemiştir. Bunlardan ikisi özellikle önemlidir. Savaş ve Barış, Polonya koleksiyonlarındaki Türk sanatı şaheserleri sergisi, 1999'da İstanbul'da, 2000'de Varşova'da sergilenmiştir. Polonya koleksiyonlarındaki İran sanatı şaheserleri sergisi ise 2002'de Varşova Ulusal Müzesi'nde ve Krakow Ulusal Müzesi'nde sergilenmiştir. Profesör Majda, Kral Stanislav Poniatowski'nin halen Varşova Üniversitesi Kütüphanesi'nde bulunan koleksiyonundan 18. yüzyıl Türk kostüm ve tiplemelerinin çizimlerini içeren bir de albüm yayınlamıştır. Profesör Majda.
Good day to everybody, and merhaba. I would like to concentrate on the ceremonial entries of the Polish envoys to the Ottoman Empire, to Istanbul, to the Ottoman court, especially in the point of view of iconography, which is quite important also in the studies of art. As you know, the first embassy dispatched by the Polish king, as we have already known, was sent to Bursa in 1414, and then later all the embassies went to Istanbul. Between the taking of Constantinople and the partitioning of Poland by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, in the late 18th century, Polish diplomatic missions made their way to the old palace in Istanbul, and after Mehmed II erected the new seat of Topkapı and the Baba Ali, the Sublime Porte, the seat of the Grand Vizier. The estimated number of Polish diplomatic missions sent to the Ottoman Empire during almost 400 years of mutual relation is about 160. Most of these missions would be described in written accounts by the participants, most usually by the mission secretary, but only a dozen or so of these accounts have been published and have become the object of a critical study. Among them, they are mostly written in Polish, all these publications. Only one dealing with the mission of the Poniatowski, Piotr Potocki, is in French, so it's much more accessible. From the 16th century onwards, Ottoman Turkey was considered to be one of the most important countries from the perspective of Polish foreign policy. Poland's political interrelationship with the Cossacks, Tatars, and with the entities of Wallachia and Moldavia entailed frequent diplomatic interventions at the Sublime Porte. It comes as little surprise that, therefore, that apart from the great European powers, it was Poland which dispatched the greatest number of diplomatic missions to Turkey. Our present-day knowledge of Ottoman court ceremonies derives first and foremost from the kanunnamés, legal codes, and also tashrifat defterleri, books of ceremonies, and also from accounts by the European envoys and members of the retinues. A number of Turkish and European authors have also published works devoted to Ottoman court ceremony, including audiences before the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. I will not mention all of them because the list is quite long, but of course there are some valuable sources to study this protocol. The first Kanunname, codifying the relevant rules, was written towards the end of the reign of Mehmed II. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Kanunname underwent a number of modifications, and some of its provisions were elaborated upon in greater detail. The ceremonies gained in splendor, and the point where the reception of an envoy became a sumptuous, elaborate affair characterized by a grandeur unmatched at other European courts, let alone as the European ones. Once arrival of a diplomatic mission was acknowledged, it was accompanied most typically from the outer frontier of the Ottoman Empire, taken for these purposes as including the Ottoman Protectorate of Moldavia as well, by an Ottoman official with a dedicated escort whose members guided the diplomats on the route to Istanbul and were responsible for their safety. The route followed by Polish embassies was always agreed in advance with the Sublime Porte and usually led from the border crossing the town of Yassi and on through Galati, Cilicia, and Edirne. The travel expenses of the mission, including accommodation, catering, and fodder, were customarily covered by the court of the Sultan out of the grand agreed tayin. It is the budget earmarked for the embassy from the Ottoman treasury. Some of the Polish embassies numbered several dozen, or even a few hundred people, and generally strove for a grand effect. In special cases, the entry of a foreign envoy and his mission to Istanbul became a gala ceremony in its own right. The program of such an entree was generally fixed. Also, a mihmandar was always assigned to attend the given occasion, receiving his instructions from the port and arranging the details with the envoy. Of the Polish embassies accorded such special treatment by the Ottoman hosts, one might mention the entry into Istanbul of Ambassador Rafał Leszczyński, voivode of Oleńczyca, in 1700. Leszczyński's mission numbered no less than 463 people, traveling with 670 horses and around 63 carriages. Alas, no detailed description or iconographic representation of this grand retinue has survived. The most accurately described and represented of the Polish embassies to the Sublime Porte was the last one, led by Count Piotr Potocki. Entry of this mission through Pera and on the Golden Horn has been depicted by a beautiful watercolor by Luigi Meyer. You have a certain detail of the painting by a famous Orientalist painter of the 18th century and the first-hand witness of the events. Meyer dedicated his drawing of Piotr Potocki's gala entry to Istanbul to the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte, Sir Robert Ainslie. And please, the first illustration, if it's possible, much more detail. Yes. There is an I can evet ben de yapabilirim. Burada mı? Sol tarafta? Yok, birinci. Evet, kalsın. There is of course, inscription in Italian with a date given by Luigi Meyer, and the procession is depicted in 9 snaking bands, as you see here. Turkish infantrymen and riders traveling in pairs lead the way, following by the main body of the Polish legation in escort of janissaries and trailed by dragoons and on horseback. A description of Piotr Potocki's procession is given by Waliszewski. As I mentioned, the publication in 2 volumes is very valuable because it's quite detailed about the embassy of Potocki to Istanbul. And he says that the envoy, after 10 o'clock in the morning, having arranged the order of the entire parade, proceeded from the palace to his palace to the shore of the sea canal, assisting by following, and then he is numbering all the members of the retinue, the Turkish and the Polish, and also what is very valuable in this description, that it gives a detailed description of each dress of the people on the guard, how they are dressed, in what color, what are they accompanying by arms, and so on and so on. This is, in point of view of artistic description, very valuable source. And then he mentions all the people by name, also the Turkish members and the Polish members with all their functions. Having arrived at the seashore, to the palace called Tophane, he says, Tophana is Tophane, the envoy ordered the janissaries and the entire above-mentioned parade and retinue to cross over to Constantinople, having embarked on boats with 3 pairs of oars, and upon the casting of 60 boats, the same envoy, taking with him the secretary and the counselor of the legation, stopped onto a gilt barge sent for him by the Çavuş Başı, decorated with Turkish rag and a back panel, with 7 pairs of oars. Within half an hour, he arrived at the Vezir Iskelesi, the place designated for disembarkation by envoys. At this place, he was taken over by the awaiting Mihmandar and 2 attendants who, having greeted him, invited him to Kirecibaşı house, at which all Christian envoys are received on audience days. After he was led in there, he took the foremost place, distinguished with the back panel, and there promptly arrived at Çavuş Başı Aga, who, having taken a seat at the envoy's right and expressed his compliments on behalf of the port, plied the envoy and likewise the secretary and the counselor of the legation, the sons of the envoy, his friends, and all the gentlemen in waiting, who were already seated upon prepared sofas, with coffee, sorbet, incense, and perfume. Also, smoking of tobacco was reserved only for the envoy and for him, it means for the Çavuş Başı. And seeing as close by his place called Vezir Iskelesi, not far from his house, for receiving the envoy found only a horse richly arrayed in decorated trappings and a gold-embroidered parade cover sent for him from the stables of the Sultan, but also another 39 horses beautifully adorned for his retinue and 21 more rented for his escort. He did not delay the king, the day being marked by unstable weather, and promptly upon conclusion of the reception described above, he ordered the master of his court to invite all ready themselves in accordance with the order instructed. Without delay, then audience entry proceeded in following order. And now he is describing by detail each person who is attending this retinue from the beginning, from the most important persons, starting by the envoy and the Çavuş Başı, the Mihmandar, and so on. That is a valuable source also of terminology, and which is given by him also in Turkish, not only in Polish and French, but also in Turkish, all these titles. So I will leave it away. Envoys and their retinues arrived in the first courtyard of the palace and dismounted. The envoy and some of his retainers then proceeded to the second courtyard, location of the Kubaltı pavilion, as you know, housing the divan hall. They were ushered into a chamber adjoining to the divan hall, where courtesies were exchanged and the envoys were asked about the object of the mission. The members of the embassy then received gifts of kaftans, which were dropped onto their shoulders by servants, and they were invited to help themselves to goblets of sorbet. It was here that the embassy was met by the Grand Vizier and by the second and the third viziers. The vizier and the envoy sat on stools, while the other members of the mission remained standing. Ceremonial greetings were exchanged once again, and the envoy was again asked to elaborate on object of his embassy through his translator. The entire party was then invited to dine in the divan hall. The welcoming and farewell audiences before the Sultan were held in the petitions hall, Ars Odası, known also just after the building, just known very well, just after the Babysade. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman court ceremony became highly formalized and rigid. The Sultan remained seated on his throne, a kind of podium covered with textiles and cushions, in an immobile position, while the assorted Turkish dignitaries, a member of the embassy, remained standing. As for the envoy, he could be seated after bowing to the Sultan and kissing his hand. The main substantive point of the audience comprised presentation of a document to the Sultan's chamberlain by the embassy secretary. There were no ceremonial speeches in situations where the envoy gave a speech, as was the case during the embassy of Jan Gniński, remained an exception. The envoy and his retinue were expected to assume a bent position. We will see it later. Each guest was supported by two Ottoman courtiers who, when the need arose, helped them to assume the correct posture. A valuable source of reliable iconographic information about the audiences at the Ottoman court is comprised in 4 gouache drawings done by French artist Paul Cévennes in 1679, now in the collections of Princess Czartoryski Museum in Krakow. The first one, second one. Burası mı? Right. The first drawing shows the envoy being welcomed at the divan hall, while janissaries receive the pay. It was usually done on the day of the payment to show the grandeur, I mean the mightiness of the empire with the same day when the payment was given to the janissaries. Some members of the envoy staff are seen standing to the left. The second drawing shows the meal served to the diplomats in the same room. The envoy and his staff were invited to dine at 5 low. This is not the same. This is not another one. This is the second one. The first one was this was the first one with the payment to the Janissaries, and this is the second one. Shows the envoy being welcomed at shows the meal served at the diplomats in the same room. The envoy and his staff were invited to dine at a few low tables. Seated at the central table is the envoy in the company of the vizier, and then company of Żewuski, a secretary to the mission, and Jan Gniński's two sons are seated at another table with the kubbevezirleri. Numerous servants are placing assorted food and drink on the floor, as you see in the front of the painting. The next drawing shows Jan Gniński being received by the Sultan Mehmed IV in the Arz Odası. The Sultan is seated upon his throne with Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa standing before him along with four viziers of lesser rank. Standing at the opposite end of the hall are five members of the embassy: the envoy Jan Gniński, his sons Jan and Vladislav, the French diplomat Perrier, and the secretary Michał Żewuski, or maybe some other. Each of them is supported by two courtiers here on the right. Gniński is holding a sheet of paper and giving a brief speech to a dragoman of the port, who was Alexander Mauro Cordato Iskerlet-Oğlu. Gniński greeted the Sultan on behalf of King Jan Sobieski and expressed the Polish monarch's desire for peace between two countries. Visible through the windows, here to the right, but not very clear, to the windows from the gate on the Arz Odası or the other side, are palace servants displaying gifts brought by the embassy before then. It was a new and not very testified tradition, because earlier usually the gifts were displayed in a different place where near to the harem, on the bank to the divan hall. So this is something new which should be studied. The last drawing shows Jan Gniński visiting the Grand Vizier at the Sublime Porte on 11 March 1678, just before his departure from Istanbul. Kara Mustafa is seated on a stool in the center of the hall, and the envoy on a slightly lower stool facing him. Coffee and sorbet is being served, and Gniński and his retinue receive ceremonial garments as well. There survive many written descriptions of audiences granted by sultans and grand viziers to European envoys, as well as drawings of oil paintings on this theme. I would like to show you some other, to take the opportunity to show you other depictions, maybe not such accurate as those one who are really a testimony of what's happened. Also, the artist was not a Polish and not a member of the mission of the embassy, but he received a detailed description through the French embassy by the Perrier, who assisted the reception, and probably on this basis he could draw this for paintings. There is a quite interesting example of a let's say a watercolor. It is a watercolor painted by a renowned Polish painter Juliusz Kosak in the 19th century, depicting entry of Polish envoy to Istanbul, Fredro Wawrzyniec Frędro, in 150 1500. So it is a imagination of artists how it could be, how the envoy could be received. When he is just drawing attention to the variety of costume, much more horses costume, and that it is his main aim. And in the background you see, you know, not the exact place of the monuments, because you see also a lot of mosques, not only Hagia Sophia but also other, just to have a background on and an imagination of Istanbul. And the most, but he's very accurate in depicting the garments and the colors of the Turkish accompanying guards and also the Polish ones. Another interesting is this one. Is also a drawing by an artist who was not visited Turkey. He just could read the descriptions of the embassy by Potocki, and then he made this quite interesting drawing, which is quite known in Poland and many times published. You see the same situation which we seen in the former gouache paintings by Sévin, but in a different situation. It's not like this. It's much more according to the European standard, to showing these audiences in Kubaltı or then in Arzodaşı. So we see also the Sultan and the translator, the Polish ambassador Potocki, the Polish members of the embassy with the Turkish courtiers accompanying them. There is a third, quite strange, I would say, depiction, a painting by a less-known Polish painter, Wędrychowski, Lucjan Wędrychowski, probably from Krakow. It is an oil painting, which was, of course, in the 19th century, Poland had no diplomatic relation with Turkey, so it couldn't be a depiction of a Polish envoy to the Ottoman court. It was a reflection of the earlier times when Poland used to send envoys so often, where to remind the public how it was in the past when Poland was an empire, existed as an important place in Europe and played a great role in diplomatic relations. This painting is made after, probably, according to me, after Van Moor, because Van Moor's painting is maybe the same with some little exceptions which he changed in his painting, but it's only a question where he could get the paintings of Van Moor, because at the time they were not exposed, probably so, not published, not any book was not album was not published, so it's still a mystery, but it's quite interesting in details. And instead of French persons, I mean French attendants, and he made Polish in Polish garments, which is very exactly up according to the Polish form of attire. Then we have a really important and let's say veritable depiction of reception by Grand Vizier of the Polish diplomat, Polish envoy to the Ottoman court, Karol Boskambla-Sopolski, before the Grand Vizier Darendali Mehmet in 1777. It was made by the Polish court architect and artist of King Stanisław Poniatowski, who accompanying the envoys to Istanbul, and King sent him specially that he should draw all the events during the way to Istanbul and during the mission of the envoy. So he did this, and this was sent every time when he depicted something of the event, the reception or a stay in a place. He depicted it and sent it to the king like a telegram today. And later, when they arrived in Istanbul, he accompanied the envoys all the time. So he depicted too a reception, by the Grand Vizier, and another one by the Sultan. I have not could get it here. So this is the description of all members of the being here represented, also Turks and Poles assisted to the retinue, and this is an extraordinary source of studying the ceremonial. To the end, I would like to mention also two which are exposed in our exhibition, two paintings of which are painted in Poland, two by not a Polish painter, but these are painted by Antoine Favray, famous Orientalist painter. These are copies, of course, of the famous paintings of him by presenting Comte de Vergennes before the Sultan Osman III. So these two paintings are copies, very exact copies of the original by Favray. The one by Sultan and another by the Grand Vizier. An important element of any embassy was comprised in gifts for the sultans, for the Grand Vizier, and for the assorted dignitaries of the Ottoman court. In fact, the success or failure of a mission could depend on the quantity and value of appropriately chosen presents. The accounts of embassies generally specify the gifts presented to the Sultan and the officials of the port. We have a lot of records giving the detailed descriptions of gifts given to each person, starting from Sultan, Grand Vizier, and other persons. The account of the mission of Rafał Leszczyński, which I mentioned earlier in 1700, includes the following intermission. There were, as you remember, a great number of people who came, 463. The presents, for example, just some examples. For the emperor, a silver clock with a table, a silver fountain, a silver table with two larger gueridons, 2 hounds. For the Grand Vizier, a silver table with 2 gueridons, 2 pairs of giant silver candle holders, a gold and colored receptacle. The list then proceeds to enumerate the gifts for the Kyahya, the Aga of the Janissaries, the Reis Effendi, the Serasker, Defterda, and for the translator also is Kaledoghlu, a filigree basket, for example, with 7 bottles, an amber watch, a decorative box, a snuff holder, an amber chalice, and a box of check stones. It has happened known that it has been known to happen that a conscientious envoy dipped into his own coffers in order to increase the number of gifts chosen by his principals. For example, Mniszek, envoy of King August III to Sultan Osman III, found himself forced to purchase gifts by himself in Istanbul because the items dispatched through Venice were somehow lost along the way. So he was obliged to buy gifts, new gifts, out of his own pocket, expensive. And the Sultan and Grand Vizier reached, of course, with the sum for he's given the sum of the gifts he bought in Istanbul was about 11,000 zlotys. So the Topkapi archives preserve inventories of gifts presented to the sultans by envoys. Alas, The same cannot be said for many of the actual items. One exception, however, which you can also see in our exhibition, is presented in a dozen or so pieces surviving from a porcelain set of originally 160 pieces commissioned by the King Stanisław Poniatowski as a gift for Abdülhamid I. Thank you very much.